Please like and subscribe for future content. 4 short stories of real ghost encounters. Number 1. The Crying Girl. I was camping with my husband and his family at a small, remote lake in our state. Our state, Nanometer, has always had many stories of paranormal activity just about everywhere. Well, on this camping trip, there were about 10 of us off the shore of the lake and one other group of people camping, maybe like 6 of them, at the next site over off the shore. It was nighttime and both our group and the other were doing typical activities, making s'mores, having a few drinks, telling stories, when all of a sudden we all heard what sounded like a little girl yelling out for help. The other group of campers asked us if we had any children in the group. We didn't. Neither did they. But we were all positive we were hearing a little girl and decided to search the area we heard the noises from together. Rather quickly we found something. There was a field behind our campsites, and we all saw a very tall, pure white figure standing maybe 100 feet away from us in the field, making the noises. We all agreed this thing looked maybe 6 feet tall, skinny, and white as can be. Everyone got quiet, but we were all together still and made our way closer to investigate. Whatever it was that we saw started backing off as we got closer, until it disappeared beyond some trees. Every single person in both campsites was freaked out by this, and that night while we tried to sleep, we continued to hear those little girl calling for help sounds. It gives me chills to think back on this. Number 2. The Walking Dead. I'm a psychiatric nurse. Early in my career, I worked at a residential mental health facility. There was a resident I'll call Marion Dutchine. He was an elective mute, which simply means that he couldn't talk, but there were no pathological findings as to why. He had spoken earlier in his life and in fact seemed quite normal. Back then, with the notable exception of being close to 7 feet tall. He'd been raised in the Deep South and joined the military when he was 19. After boot camp, he was stationed somewhere in the South. One night, he just vanished. It was declared in AWOL for years, and finally, he was declared missing and dead. 10 years later, a 7-foot-tall man walked into a VA hospital emergency room in my part of the Midwest and said to the receptionist, and quote, "My name is Marion Dutchine and I've been dead for 10 years, and quote. Those were the last words he ever spoke. He was covered with dust and he was wearing the same clothes he'd been reported to be wearing the night he vanished. His social security number had not been used and he had no identification on his person. However, they were able to identify him, I guess via fingerprints. He was well fed and in good health, except for his refusal to speak. The family was notified, but they said they had already grieved their lost man and that whomever was claiming to be him simply could not be. They said he was a and quat, haint and quat, and a stand-in for their dead relative and demanded not to be contacted again. Marion paced all day every day. Not in a frantic way, but just lumbering up and down the halls and outside. He smiled all the time and would be moving his mouth in a way that indicated talking or muttering, but he was dead silent. He had an unnerving habit of throwing his head back, with his mouth wide open as if he were laughing heartily, but not even a breath could be heard. If told to go to the dining room for a meal, he'd go and eat. But if nobody told him, he just kept pacing, never indicating hunger. If offered a cigarette, he'd smoke it in an oddly formal way. Almost delicately, if that makes sense. but he never seemed to crave smoking. The man wanted nothing. If I talked to him, he appeared to listen, periodically throwing his head back in that laughter-mimicking way of his. There was nothing to do for this man. Various medications were tried, but they did not affect him either positively or negatively. Occupational therapy did nothing because Marion would just grin, and unless told to stay put, he'd get up and start pacing. Again. On my last day at that job, on my way to something better, the last thing I saw was Marion pacing in the parking lot, throwing his head back to laugh, and later I wondered if all along I'd been dealing with a ghost. All these years later, I still don't know. Number 3. No rest. Stop. I was driving across country with my mom and sister. I was 16, my sister 20, my mom in her 50s. It was late, but we were well rested still and alert. We were driving along an interstate and needed gas, and they needed to pee, so we stopped at the only rest stop in approximately 200 miles. There was a van full of teenagers on some road trip and a small gray compact car, like a Honda Accord or some shit, parked at the pump in front of us. Two men about 17 to 20 were standing outside the Honda in hoodies, statue fucking still. The teenagers were to our left. When we got there, everything felt wrong. There was a deep and unsettling feeling about the place, and we'd not felt that way at any other rest stop. We'd been on the road for days and seen many rest stops at night and had never been afraid until then. My mom and sister went inside and I stayed in the car. I heard the teenagers say they were creeped out and couldn't get the pump to work and they left in a hurry. I was mostly watching the car in front and the two men who had still not moved at all. Not an inch. They weren't talking. They weren't on phones. There was no light anywhere but the dim overhead lights on the gas station awning. They were just fucking standing there, still as stone. My sister and mom came running back out to the car, and when they got in, the two men slowly turned to look at us while not moving or pivoting the rest of their bodies, and I swear to fucking shit, we all saw the same thing. They had eyes dark as pitch and empty. Truly empty. Not black. Not reflecting any light at all. Just a fucking void. We booked it. We have not traveled in excess of 100 miles per hour before or since, but fuck, that day it was warranted. We drove until we were in the next city before we got out of the car again. And you know the worst fucking thing about it? Not the eyes, not the stillness, not that horrible feeling, not the weirdo in the gas station who kept telling my mom and sister and my mama will like you and over and over while mopping the same spot on the floor with a dry mop and an empty bucket. It was the fact that we couldn't find the place on any map. We knew exactly which spot on the interstate to look, and we couldn't fucking find it on Google Maps or any paper map we had. We even asked locals about the creepy gas station out on that stretch of road to confused looks, and are you sure you weren't traveling on highway, and not interstate, and we'd traveled on that interstate since and there was no rest stop. Number 4. Strange encounter in graveyard. Years ago, a few friends and I went to hang out in a graveyard. Stupid thing to do for a bunch of bored 18-year-olds on a weekday night, but what happened next was very real to all of our experiences. We were driving my friend's really old beat-up Subaru through the massive graveyard. We stopped to get out and walk around. We walked down a hill and came across a little pond. There was someone sitting on a rock on the other side of the pond. The figure was all black and we couldn't make out any features other than the fact it looked like a man who was wearing some old-style top hat. Stupidus waved and shouted, "Hi." He didn't show any acknowledgement or wave back. The man sat on the rock, still. All of a sudden, he jumped to his feet, started running to us on the water and then vanished in thin about halfway on the pond. My friends and I screamed and ran back to her car. I didn't want to believe what we saw, but we all saw it happen. We got back to her car and tried to start it. It wouldn't start. Frantically trying to get it started, we all started panicking and getting very scared. That's when we heard some banging on the car from the back. It wasn't a constant bang, but every few seconds or so, we'd hear it. Nobody was outside from what we could see in the dark, but something was making a noise on the car. At this point, I'm having a full-blown panic attack, screaming and crying to get us out. Luckily my friends seemed a bit less panicky than I was, and helped keep me calm. It was obvious that they were just as freaked out, however more speechless and pale-faced. We would have left the car in the graveyard and walked the long journey to the exit, if it wasn't for the banging on the car. We didn't want to get out and leave. After about minute, the banging stopped. I'll call my mom to come give us a boost, I thought. I'm not entirely sure why. None of us thought to call sooner. However, I don't believe anyone thinks rationally while panicking. At this point, 15 minutes had gone by since we got back in her car. I opened my phone and started dialing and realized I had no service. None of us had any cell service. We bantered back and forth for a few more minutes trying to figure out what to do, and decided against leaving the car because whatever was outside was not what we wanted to come face to face with. The next 30 minutes were spent trying to get her car started. No banging was heard afterwards, but we felt this heavy feeling around us, almost as if it created this pressure on our chest. It's quite difficult to explain as I've never felt anything like it before. Finally, her car started and she hit the pedal to the metal. We sped out of the graveyard so fast. Immediately crossing the gates, all of our phones regained cell service. I'll never be able to explain what caused any of this or why certain things happened. One thing I know for certain is that someone or something was out there. And it was not an animal or human.